Every man in the valley had an opinion about the Deutz, and every opinion was the same. The Deutz F3L514 that Heinrich Mayer had driven off the dealer's lot in Weilheim in the spring of 1961 was, by the common consensus of the Ammer Valley farming community, the best machine any of them had seen. 36 horsepower, air-cooled 3 cylinders, a clean design that did not require preheating in the morning or careful nursing in cold weather. It started with a key. It ran clean. It was, as the dealer had explained, and as the other farmers had confirmed through observation and conversation, and the specific evidence of 2 seasons of watching Heinrich Mayer do his field work, a modern agricultural machine in the fullest sense of that phrase. When Heinrich drove it through the valley on his way to his fields, people who had been farming for 40 years stopped to watch it pass. Some of them said things to each other that amounted to, "There is what a tractor should be." Most of them were right. Zugkraftprobe, the draft contest organized each autumn by the Ammer Valley Agricultural Cooperative, had been running since 1923. The contest was simple in principle and difficult in practice. A loaded wooden sledge, weighted with stone blocks to a precise and challenging level, was to be pulled up the slope of the Kreuzberg field on the south side of the valley, a gradient of approximately 12%, over 50 meters of clay hillside, by each participating tractor in turn. The tractor that moved the heaviest, load the full distance without stalling, was the winner. Ties were broken by adding weight until one machine failed. In 39 years of Zugkraftprobe contests, the Kreuzberg slope had been completed by fewer than a third of the machines that had attempted it. The slope did not care about specifications or dealer presentations or what the other farmers had said at the cooperative meeting. It cared about what the machine could do when the load was real, and the clay was wet, and the distance was 50 meters of 12% hillside with no moment of relief anywhere along the way. In previous years, tractors had stalled, clutches had slipped, a fent had overheated in 1958 in a way that its operator still did not entirely like to discuss. A borrowed machine from the neighboring valley had burned out its rear tires on the wet clay in 1959 and finished 7 meters short. These were the conversations that attended the Zugkraftprobe every autumn, and they had been accumulating since 1923 to produce a specific understanding of what the Kreuzberg slope required of a machine. In October of 1962, every farmer in the valley said the Deutz would set the record. They had not counted on Ernst Bauer. If this is your first story on this channel, subscribe now and hit the bell. New story every single day. Let me tell you about the Zugkraftprobe and about the Kreuzberg slope, because the geography of that specific hillside is where this story lives. The Ammer Valley south of Weilheim was farming country of the specific kind that produces a specific kind of farmer, people shaped by ground that is never quite simple, by winters that arrive without warning, and by the kind of clay soil that works against machinery, the way clay always works against machinery, unforgivingly, without exceptions, and with a complete indifference to what the manufacturer's specifications said the machine should be able to do. The Kreuzberg field was a southeast-facing slope that grew good grass in summer and turned to a dense, greasy clay surface after the autumn rains, the kind of clay that stuck to boots and pulled at wheels and made the specific sucking sound of ground that has decided to hold on to whatever enters it. It was not chosen as the contest slope because it was pleasant. It was chosen because it was honest. The stone block sledge that the cooperative maintained for the contest weighed, empty, approximately 800 kilograms. Stones were added in blocks of 50 kilograms each, the cooperative secretary writing the additions in the official ledger with the careful handwriting of a man who understood that the record mattered and that the record required precision. The record load, set in 1955 by a tractor that had since been sold to a farm in the next valley, was 1,400 kilograms of stones plus the empty sledge weight, 2,200 kilograms total, resistance up a 12% clay grade over 50 meters of autumn clay. The Deutz, by the estimate of the cooperative secretary and several farmers who had spent 2 seasons watching Heinrich Mayer work his fields, was expected to break this record comfortably. Some people said by 2 blocks, others said 3. The conversation at the cooperative office in September had included a brief discussion of whether to raise the maximum load for this year's contest, specifically in anticipation of what the Deutz would do. No decision had been made, but the conversation had been had, which said something about the community's confidence in the machine. Ernst Bauer had been farming the land at kilometer 6 on the valley's eastern end since 1934. He was 64 years old, had gray-white stubble that he shaved when he went to Weilheim and at no other time, and had the hands of a man who had been working the same clay soil for nearly 3 decades without ever finding it easy or entirely predictable. His Lanz Bulldog had come to the farm in 1946, a second-hand machine from an estate sale, a 1940 model, 6 years old at the time of purchase, which had made it, in the opinion of several people in the valley, an eccentric choice. The estate had been selling it because the heirs considered it outdated. Ernst had bought it for a price that some people had thought too high and others had thought too low, and had driven it home and put it to work. And in 16 years of field work, the machine had not given him reason to regret the decision. He was not, by nature or by practice, a man who entered contests. The Zugkraftprobe had been running since 1923, and he had watched it every year without participating. He was a man who worked his land and thought about his own business and left others to think about theirs. He was not entirely sure, even afterward, what had made him decide to enter this particular year. Possibly it was something Heinrich Mayer had said at the cooperative meeting in September, not something cruel. Heinrich was not a cruel man, but something said with the specific unhurried confidence of someone who considers an outcome settled before it has arrived. The Deutz, Heinrich had said, was a different category of machine from anything in the valley. It would show what modern agricultural engineering had achieved. Ernst had listened to this. He had looked at his coffee cup for a moment. Then he had said quietly that he would enter the Lanz. There had been a pause of perhaps 2 seconds. Then several people in the room had made the specific sound that people make when they are too polite to laugh outright, but have decided not to take the statement entirely seriously. Heinrich Mayer had said, with practiced courtesy, "Bauer, that machine is from 1940. The Kreuzberg slope in October with that load." He had not finished the sentence because the unfinished sentence contained everything that needed to be said, and everyone in the room understood it. Ernst had said nothing more. He had finished his coffee and driven home. On the morning of the contest, the Lanz was third in the line of 5 entering machines. Ahead of it, a Fendt and a Massey Ferguson borrowed from a farm 2 valleys over. Behind it, the Deutz, which had been entered last because last is where you put the machine that everyone expects to win. Let me tell you what Ernst Bauer knew about the Kreuzberg slope, and about his Lanz that the other farmers in the valley did not fully know, because this is where the story turns from a foregone conclusion into something the valley would be discussing for years. The Zugkraftprobe on the Kreuzberg slope was not, at its core, a contest of horsepower. It appeared to be a contest of horsepower, because machines with more horsepower generally performed better than machines with less. But the specific combination of a 12% clay hillside, a loaded wooden sledge with steel runners, and 50 meters of sustained pull created a test of a more precise quality than horsepower ratings captured. On a clay slope under sustained load, the critical variable is not peak power but traction continuity. The machine that wins the Kreuzberg is the one that can maintain continuous contact between its rear tires and the clay surface while delivering maximum torque without interruption. Not maximum torque in bursts, without interruption. The clay slope is patient. It waits for the moment when the tire pressure against it eases, and when that moment arrives, however briefly, the clay uses it to recover its surface and break the machine's grip. The Deutz F3L514's three-cylinder air-cooled engine produced its 36 horsepower through a firing sequence at approximately 1700 RPM under load. Three cylinders firing at that speed produced smooth, even power delivery by the standards of most field work. The engine was efficient. But under maximum load on a clay slope, the firing cadence of three cylinders at 1700 RPM created a pattern of downward tire pressure that was, however subtly, not entirely continuous. Between firing strokes, for fractions of a second, the downward force from the drivetrain eased fractionally. The clay registered these fractions. The Lanz Bulldog's single hot bulb cylinder fired once per revolution at approximately 600 RPM, one firing stroke per second. The massive flywheel, a spinning iron disc of considerable weight, stored the energy of each firing stroke and released it smoothly into the drivetrain between strokes. Between firing strokes, the flywheel's inertia maintained the drivetrain's motion and the rear tire's downward pressure against the clay. There was no ease. There was no recovery moment for the clay. The tire pressure against the slope was continuous. Ernst's rear tires were also wider than any other machine in the contest, a detail that produced lower ground pressure per square centimeter on the clay, which meant less sinkage into the clay, which meant more contact area between tire and slope, which meant more traction. Not more power, more of the power that existed being successfully transmitted to the ground. He had known these things in the way that practical men know practical things. Through observation of what the Lanz did on the Kreuzberg slope in difficult autumn conditions, through noting what the clay surface looked like under the Lanz's tires versus under other tires, through the accumulated attention of 16 years of working on the same land, with the same machine, in the same conditions. He had not thought about it in terms of flywheel inertia or ground pressure coefficients. He had thought about it in terms of what happened when the going was hard. The Lanz kept going, or it did not. His had always kept going. He knew the Lanz would finish. Subscribe now if you have not yet, because what happens on the Kreuzberg slope is the reason this valley still talks about Ernst Bauer and this machine. The Fent went first and covered 42 meters before stalling. Good distance. The crowd approved. The borrowed Massey Ferguson went second and reached 47 meters, the best distance anyone had managed in several years at that load weight, and the crowd approved more warmly. Someone near the back said, "Wait for the Deutz." Several people agreed. Ernst Bauer drove the Lanz to the base of the Kreuzberg slope. He had heated the Glühkopf in the barn before driving to the contest, which meant the engine was already at temperature by the time he arrived. The cooperative secretary looked at the Lanz at the base of the slope and wrote something in his notebook without comment. The farmers nearest the base of the slope watched Ernst attach the sledge hook to the drawbar with the quiet attention that people give to something they are not sure how to classify. Heinrich Mayer, on the Deutz waiting at the staging area, watched Ernst make the attachment. He said nothing. His expression was the careful expression of a man who has decided not to comment. Ernst checked the drawbar connection. He looked at the slope. He looked at his rear tires. He engaged the clutch. The Lanz went up the Kreuzberg slope. Pum pum pum. Not fast, the Lanz never went fast. 1 beat per second. The exhaust pipe sent a thin thread of dark smoke into the October air. The rear tires wide, pressing into the clay with the distributed force of a machine designed for sustained field work, left two clear parallel tracks that did not dig or churn. They pressed. They held. At 10 meters, the Lanz had not slowed. The engine note had not changed. The machine did not hunt for a lower gear. It continued at the pace it had set at the base, 1 beat per second, the flywheel absorbing the slope's resistance between strokes and returning it smoothly as continuous traction. Several people in the crowd had stopped talking. At 30 meters, Ernst passed the fence mark. At 47 meters, he passed the Massey's marker. He kept going. Pum pum pum. At 50 meters, Ernst Bauer drove the Lanz over the finish line at the top of the Kreuzberg slope, pulling 1,400 kilograms of stone and sledge, and stopped the machine with the same unhurried movement he used to stop it at the end of any furrow on his farm. He turned off the throttle. The engine continued at idle. The crowd at the base was making a noise. Heinrich Mayer drove the Deutz to the base. He attached the sledge and added 2 more stone blocks, 70 kilograms more than Ernst had pulled, because the record required beating, not matching. The Deutz's engine turned over with the clean efficiency that 2 seasons of fieldwork had confirmed. He engaged the clutch and the Deutz went up the Kreuzberg slope. At 15 meters, the front began to lift slightly. Modern tractors carry their weight toward the rear, and under maximum pulling load the front lines. Heinrich corrected with his weight, and the Deutz continued. At 30 meters, the rear tires broke traction. Not catastrophically. The clay surface, which had accepted the Lanz's wide tire continuous press without yielding, offered the Deutz's narrower tires a different answer. The fractional ease in downward pressure between the 3-cylinder firing strokes, invisible on flat ground, irrelevant in normal field work, gave the clay a moment to recover its surface at 30 meters of wet clay slope under maximum load. The tires slipped a half rotation. The engine RPM rose briefly. Then the tires found the surface again and the Deutz continued, but it had lost ground. At 42 meters, the pattern repeated. At 44 meters, the Deutz stalled. Not from lack of power, the engine was running. The machine stalled because the load and the slope had brought the rear wheel speed to a point where the clay's recovered grip was insufficient to continue forward motion. Heinrich cut the throttle and sat on the Deutz at 44 meters on the Kreuzberg slope. He looked uphill at the finish line, 6 meters ahead and still unreached. He looked at the 2 clean parallel tire tracks the Lanz had left in the clay, running all the way to the top without interruption. He sat there for a long time. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell. New story every single day. He found Ernst Bauer at the base of the slope after the cooperative secretary had recorded the official results. "Bauer," he said. Ernst looked at him. "The tires," Heinrich said, "the width and the flywheel." "Yes," Ernst said. "Your engine fires once per second. The pressure on the clay never breaks between strokes." "No," Ernst said. "Between strokes the flywheel holds it. The clay never gets a moment." Heinrich thought about this carefully. He was a practical man, and the practical part of his mind was doing what it always did, converting observation into understanding. "I had more power," he said. "You had better peak power," Ernst said. "At full load on wet clay, peak power arrives in intervals. The intervals are when you slip." He looked at the slope. "On the Kreuzberg in October, you cannot afford intervals." Heinrich looked at the slope for a long time. Then, to the surprise of the people nearby, he laughed, not bitterly, not defensively, but with the genuine recognition of a man who has just understood something true. "Will the Lanz still be running when I learn the slope properly?" he said. "Yes," Ernst said simply, "it will." The cooperative secretary recorded the 1962 Zugkraftprobe result. First place, Lanz Bulldog 1940, Ernst Bauer, full distance, 1,400 kilograms. Second place, Massey Ferguson, 47 meters. Third place, Deutz F3L514, 44 meters. The valley talked about it through the winter. Not mainly about the Deutz. The Deutz was a fine machine and people knew it. They talked about it because results like this require re-examining assumptions. And re-examining assumptions is one of the things that farming communities do in winter when the work is lighter, and the evenings are long and the subject is worth the attention. Ernst Bauer won the Zugkraftprobe again in 1963 and in 1965. He retired from competition in 1966 and gave Heinrich Mayer the entry form, having already paid the cooperative fee. He said, "Take the Deutz and go at it properly." Heinrich won in 1966. He told Ernst afterward, "I went slower, I didn't push the load, I learned the slope first." Ernst said, "That is correct. The slope teaches you, you just have to let it." The Lanz Bulldog fired on the third turn of the crank until 1979, when Ernst's son took over the farm. His son kept it in the barn and started it twice a year, and used it for the steep field work on the eastern end of the property that everything else handled less well. Pum pum pum. Every farmer in the valley had bet on the Deutz. The Kreuzberg slope had not consulted their opinions. It had done what clay slopes have always done. It waited for the machine that understood how to press against it without letting go, and it gave its answer to that machine and no other. The Lanz had pressed, without letting go. For 50 meters of wet October clay, 1 beat per second, the flywheel holding between strokes what the clay was waiting to take. It never let go. Pum pum pum.